So we're on the cusp of celebrating Pesach for 5784, the 3,336th time we'll be celebrating Pesach, because we celebrated it actually in Egypt before we left. And we're also going to read Parshat Metzorah, which continues the theme of Parshat Tazria last week, which has to do with Tzarat, the spiritual condition that primarily affects people who are speaking evilly and hatefully about others. The theme tonight is tell the whole story. As we all know, our responsibility on Pesach night, and for us in the diaspora, it's Monday night, and we do it again on Tuesday night, is to tell the whole story, to tell the story of leaving Egypt. And I dare say this year we're in a different place than we ever would have imagined we would be in a year ago. And I think that the story we need to really focus on what the whole story is and what it includes. And there's a big background to this, what I won't go into, but a friend of mine is fond of telling to me that, everybody has their own story, he says, and somehow or other in their story, they're the hero. So even though, and of course, it's the perspective people take about their own lives. We tend to see ourselves larger than life. We tend to see ourselves in a good light. And of course, in order to do so, we're editors. We are great editors. We're able to cut out scenes that don't make us look so good, and maybe even add a scene or two that didn't quite happen that really make us shine. And we feel we're telling a story. When it comes to Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's a big story to tell. And I think over the years, especially the years of my lifetime, we tend to convey to our kids the joy of being rescued from Mitzrayim, which certainly is integral to celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. And as it says in the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, out of a house of bondage. But notice that God in the Ten Commandments also says, out of a house of bondage. God doesn't say, I took you out of Egypt and wow, look at the places you have gone, so to speak, because the story also includes the places you have been, including the bondage. And I wanted to enter that with a thought from this week's Torah reading, this topic of Tzarat, and the manner in which we treat a person who's afflicted with leprosy, this spiritual leprosy, this disease that can afflict your house, it can afflict your clothing, it can afflict your skin. And interestingly, if you look at chapter 13 in Vayikra, sentence 45, it's actually in last week's Parsha, it's page 616 in the Stone Chumash. We require the Metzorah to go outside of the camp, to sit alone, reflect, think about what they're missing out, being part of society, and of course the price of being an upstanding member of society who contributes positively to the upbuilding of connection amongst people, which is the antithesis of evil, hateful speech. But we expect them to do something else. It says in chapter 13, sentence 45, V'tamei yikare, that when the person afflicted with Tzarat is sitting alone outside the camp. Outside, now just think of a gated city like Yerushalayim, and has a road coming to it. And as you were entering the city, you'd see a person over here, a person over there, a person over in the other place. And they're sitting alone, and they're out there for 7 days. I mean, people take care of them, bring them food. I'm not saying that they're up for fair game, but they're isolated and alone, and they're experiencing what it means to tear down the context in which you live. But they also have to do something else. When someone approaches them, let's say I need directions, or I want to ask somebody, tell me where's the best falafel stand inside Jerusalem, and I see a guy sitting there on a rock, and I say, wow, he looks like he's from Yerushalayim. I'm heading toward him. That Metzorah, the person afflicted with Tzarat, is required to say, Tameh, I am impure, I am impure. You can talk to me, I'm happy to help you, happy to tell you where my favorite falafel stand is, but please understand, don't come too close to me, because I'm in a period of spiritual isolation, and I can contaminate people I come into contact with because I've been speaking hatefully and I've been an impediment to society getting along with each other. Now, when you think about this, it's a wow thing to contemplate. Because how do we go through life? What do people do when they go to the makeup counter? Do they say to the woman taking care of them, look, I have this big mole over here. I want to make sure everybody sees it. So figure out how you can make up my face to accentuate this one aspect of myself which I'm uncomfortable about? Or do we rather say, look, here's my better profile, got this little thing over here, I'm sure you can cover it up. I'm sure you can make me look my best. I'm sure you can help me present myself, put my best foot forward, as we say, so that people will befriend me, so that I'm accepted in society and I can make it in society. And yet we know when we speak ill of other people, we're doing the opposite. Look at that person, they're fat, they're stupid. So we're taking an entirety of a person, we're zeroing in on one aspect, which is a weakness, which is a vulnerability, which perhaps is an aspect of that person that other people have come to love and cherish. But we're not doing that. We isolate it. We do what the caricaturist does, is we look at a person, we say, we want to construe that appearance in a negative way, even though it may not be an exact or full representation of the person. And in doing so, we change the perception of that person in the minds of other people, sometimes forever. And as we know about speaking ill and hatefully, oftentimes the impacts can never, ever be undone. So we put this Metzorah in the position of saying, I want to come to grips with the reality of my story. Last week, I was in the city. Last week, I was enjoying a falafel at the falafel stand amongst my friends. But I was speaking in a hateful way. I was speaking in a way which didn't acknowledge the totality of another person, but rather zeroed in on something negative, and I accentuated that. And so here I am outside the city. Tomei, Tomei, be careful of me. I'm learning my lesson. I'm thinking it over. I'm looking forward to undergoing purification and returning as a member of society, as a full-fledged member of society, as an upholding member of society. It takes a few more days for me to get there. And in the meantime, Tomei, Tomei, I'm doing what doesn't come natural to me about myself, but which did come natural to me about other people. So we asked the Metzorah, go contrary to what is ordinary human nature, so that you can expand your sense of perspective on the world and on the perspective on other people. And you can begin to really train yourself to see the totality of a person. And ultimately, as we know from our Torah, B'Tselem Elokim Nivra Ha'adam. People are created in the image of God. You know, there was once a rabbi who was particularly ugly, unsightly, and someone encountered that rabbi and said, "Oh, you're so ugly." And he said very genuinely, he said, "Why are you complaining to me? Complain to my maker." Which presents a perspective that that person, as unsightly as he may have been, came fully to terms with the idea that this is the way God made me, and I have a purpose in the world, and I have a mission in the world. And by becoming an outstanding leader of his generation and a rabbi, he overcame whatever reticence that could cause him, because he understood there's a totality of who I am, and God put me on the world for a purpose, and I'm not going to let something unsightly stand in my way. And of course, we could have this attitude toward other people as well. I'm not going to let something that's problematic for me prevent me from being your friend, prevent you from helping you, prevent me from helping you become all you possibly can become. Those are all aspects of the lesson of what this spiritual affliction, Sarat, has to do, has to accomplish. So we know human nature is, let's cover up our deficiencies. Let's put on the makeup. Let's accentuate the positive about ourselves. And if we're not feeling so comfortable about ourselves, so why don't we accentuate the negative about somebody else? So what we're doing is we're slicing, we're dicing. Interestingly enough, if we want to bridge these ideas to Pesach, there really were customs where people began the Seder sitting in rags. They would, it was a chag, they would dress nicely, they would go to the Beit Knesset, and then as they sat down to the Seder, they began dressed in rags. And they said, we experienced slavery. We were downtrodden in Egypt. This is who we were. God rescued us. So if I have a nice tie on and a good shirt, it's by dint of the fact that God swooped into Egypt and took me as a poor, broken, naked slave and elevated me and gave me an opportunity to better myself. And unlike the typical human reaction of therefore becoming, I'm going to get back at the people who enslaved me, because we know the Torah has a mitzvah not to hate the Egyptian. And unlike the typical thing, I'm going to make sure I have more than everybody else, no matter how I have to get it from them or out of them, we instead respond with this tremendous sense of thankfulness and gratefulness and connection to God, and a sense of, wow, you see, I may be dressed beautifully for the Chag, and that's the way we enter Pesach, thankfully, but I understand that where it comes from, and I understand, I'm happy about it, and I can celebrate it. But I don't celebrate it by denying the past or by saying, well, I've moved on. We eat the bitter herb at the Seder. And we have to think heavily about that as we sit down to tell the story of the Jewish people in 5784, because there's a lot of bitterness in the air. There's a lot of bitter taste in our mouths. And we don't want to just shove it under the rug, but we want to put it into perspective. And the Haggadah, as we tell our story, as heroic as it is, as much as the Haggadah may describe us all as standing on the banks of the Yam Suf and seeing the Egyptian tyrants crushed under the weight of the sea crashing down upon them, which we do recount in the Haggadah, and we do explain. We're also ready to see ourselves as having spent 210 oppressive, difficult, painful years of suffering, and come to grips with the idea of why that was. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So we want to connect these ideas. If you look at the Haggadah, and my reference here is the Art Scroll Haggadah. I think of it as the big blue book. It comes in different forms. It was done by Rabbi Joseph Elias. It was very memorable to me. It was one of the early books that Art Scroll published. If you look there on page 102, as we tell the story, we go through the years of bondage and suffering. And people tell me that it was very common for Holocaust survivors who had regained their ability to speak about their experiences to relate in very vivid ways this section of the Haggadah to their own experience in the camps, and not to depress people, and not to get people's sympathy toward themselves, but rather to make it clear that this is part of life. And I think I've said in this discussion before, there's an area in Yad Vashem in Israel that has hand drawings made by artistic people in Auschwitz. And when you look at those drawings with the lashes and the whipping and carrying heavy burdens and from different camps and different experiences that survivors or people who didn't survive lived through, when you look at it, my first impression was they were drawing pictures as they imagined enslavement in Egypt to have been. But no, they were drawing about their own actual experiences. And then the healthy thing is God put me through these experiences, as we'll see, for a purpose. And I still own that experience in the sense of realizing it's part of who I am. And maybe in that part of my story, I wasn't quite the hero I could have been. That's not the issue, but it's still part of my story. It doesn't get edited out on the editing floor. I'm willing to look at it. So what do we read in Haggadah? If you look at page 102, It says, God found us in Egypt, a Rome ve'er naked, shabby, bereft of any endearing qualities. That's the way God saw us there. That's the way we describe ourselves. Now, there's not esoteric, there are important commentaries that say it refers to we were bereft of mitzvot. We didn't have much merit going for us. And after all, Moshe himself, standing at the bush, said, God, why do you want to take these people out? I mean, yeah, they're my people. I love them. I care about them. I put out for them myself when I was in Egypt. But what's triggering you to rescue them? And of course, that's where Moshe experiences this moment of tsaras, puts his hand and takes it out because he was speaking ill of the Jewish people. And although commentaries talk about us being naked in terms of being bereft of mitzvot, an important commentary, the Chidah, says God saw us with a sense of love and a sense of attachment. And as it says in that same sentence, B'domaye chayi, B'domaye chayi, which has many meanings, but we're going to look at two of them. And we say this, by the way, they say the sentence at a Brit Milah, a circumcision, where blood was spilled. And we know that that blood being spilt at a Brit is at a joyous moment of welcoming a member into the Jewish people. And in many ways, this was our inauguration into becoming an eternal people of God. So what does it mean? So the Chidah says, because in our very blood was the identity of being descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, and Rebecca, and Rivka, and Leah, and Rachel. Sorry, left one out. That's who we were in our essence. We were proud of it. We retained our identity. And in our most downtrodden, dirty, smelly, broken state, and we all have seen the pictures of what Jewish people in this state look like. God saw beauty, and God saw within us, and God saw intrinsically. He saw the big picture. He could have disparaged us. Oh, who wants these skinny, broken, smelly, dirty, starving people? Let me look around the world and find someone else. But no, God said, I see the full picture. And I see within these people the blood of Jewish identity that's capable of rebuilding, of spiritually re-embracing Judaism, of celebrating freedom in the most special, precious way, just as we did when we went out of Egypt. That's a moment in the Haggadah to stop on this year. It's a moment where to reflect on and to realize the sense that there's a lot of blood has been spilled. A lot of Jewish blood has been spilled. We all can name people. We can name people and faces that are in captivity now, and who knows if they're alive or not. But when we look at the big picture of that, that's the fellow Jew who has in their essence all the grandeur and greatness that we aspire to bring out in ourselves. And that's why the Haggadah says, God found us naked, bereft, but God found us b'domaye chayi, looking at the totality of who we were, looking at the essence of who we were. The Chidah says we have something eternal, unbreakable, and that became apparent because that's almost all we had left at that point. Something to really think about as part of the story that we're going to tell next Monday night and Tuesday night at the Seder of 5784. The next point in the Seder, page 112 in this Haggadah. The sentence described Vieta Malena, we were burdened, we were broken, it was back-breaking for us. And interestingly, the Haggadah quotes the Medrash Eo Habonim. We're talking about the children here. Why? Because at a critical point, called Ben Hayilod, Hayora Tashrichuhu, our children were thrown into the Nile River. Pharaoh decreed that all the male children would be disposed of ruthlessly. Now, someone asked, what does that have to do with burdens? And someone answers very beautifully with the idea that because our children, the nature of people is that children are the future. And even if my life is difficult, and think of all the immigrants who came to America who had a push cart or who sewed clothing in a tenement 14, 15 hours a day, and who, if they missed a day because they were too sick to work, meant that they'd have to miss meals, and their children and their wife and their families would also miss meals. And that's the way they lived their entire lives. But they did so with a vision. Our children will have it better. My kid is going to go to City College. He's going to become an accountant. He's going to become an engineer. He's going to be a college graduate. And he's going to be an accepted member of American society. And so the situation the Jewish people found themselves in Egypt became intolerable and burdensome only when that future was called into question. And certainly when you speak to the coming generations today, we have to tell them, yeah, having children is a pain. It's sleepless nights and it's expense and it's paying for Jewish education and being embarrassed because my kid isn't as good as I thought he would be at 8 years old or at 10 years old. And I need to interact with him or her, and I need to teach him and correct him. And I need to still show them love, and I still need to show them kindness, and I need to show confidence in them. And these are not easy things to do. And that's why rates of childbirth plummet. Because as we raise ever more self-centered kids, their attitude is, kids, what are you kidding? That's not for me. So we have to highlight in the Haggadah that people can withstand great deprivation with strength when they foresee a future, and if a future not even for themselves. Many Jews were born and died in Egyptian slavery and never stood at the banks of the Yam Suf and saw the Egyptians being destroyed. But no matter who they were, they lived for a better life for their descendants. They broadened their vision time-wise beyond the scope of their own 70 or 80 years, whatever it would be. And they saw, I'm investing, I'm creating, I'm building. And that made their burdens lighter. And indeed, Holocaust survivors talk the same way. And how much did they pour energy into their children with all so much hope and so much prayer, saying, yeah, I endured a lot. And many kept their mouths closed because they couldn't tell their stories, thinking it would limit their kids. And yet we know now with perspective that these stories can make us stronger and make us greater. We have to avail ourselves of that as we sit down and we tell the story in the Haggadah. And then you move a few more pages ahead, and I go to page 116. Vayotzienu Hashem mi Mitzrayim. God took us out of Egypt, not through an angel and not through a seraph. God personally. God got his hands dirty. God ran around Egypt, slaying the firstborn of the Egyptians, checking each doorway, making sure Jewish houses were untouched. That's why we call it Pesach. God personally skipped over us, protected us, gave us instructions, stay inside, stay in the safe room, mark out the door with the blood of the Paschal Lamb. You know, you can't walk amongst the Egyptians when I'm judging them, because after all, who do you think you are? You're also children of God, just like them. So you stay inside, you celebrate the first Pesach Seder in history, and I'll do my job of taking you out personally. And we need ways of personalizing our connection with God. And if there's any story of your own you can add or tell, any experience, and such experiences really happen every day of our lives, we should do so. Because this is what it means to tell the whole story. And to tell, you know, when they swear in a witness, you have to tell the truth and the whole truth. Because telling less than the whole truth is not telling the truth at all. It's a big idea. We won't discuss it further tonight. And this perspective is epitomized in the story that Talmud tells about Rebbe Akiva, the famous Rebbe Akiva, who could stand over the destruction of the temple while the ground was still smoldering, and while foxes were literally running through what once was the Holy of Holies, and he could laugh and he could look ahead with joy. The same Rabbi Akiva who, when he traveled once, the Talmud tells us, he was looking for a simple place to live and he was excluded from the city. So he slept in the hill. And then the wind came and blew out his only fire, so he was in the darkness. And then an animal came, his donkey was killed, his rooster died. He was left with nothing. Everything that he had with him, he was left with. And each and every time that happened, he said, he didn't say Gam Zulatova. He didn't say this is also for the best. He said something even stronger. He said, Kol man da'avid rachmana letav avid. Everything that God does, everything that happens is for the good. And he didn't say that after the story ended, when he woke up in the morning and he saw that city had been attacked, and that he stayed in the lodge, he would have been killed together with other people visiting there. And if his donkey would have been alive, it would have brayed, or his rooster could have made noise, or his candle would have attracted attention, and the very murderers who rampaged through the city would have killed him also. He didn't need to wait for the end of the story to celebrate the difficult parts of the story, the greatness of Rebbe Akiva that he learned from his Rebbe, Nachum Ish Gamzu. Nachum, who was famous for saying this also is for the good, was that even in the midst of everything, even in the midst of burying young soldiers every day of the week, he had the perspective of saying, I can't explain anything. This doesn't look good to me. But kol man da'avid rachmana, every act, everything that takes place is for the good. It has a good bearing. It will have a good outcome. The Vilna Gaon was famous for quoting, said, what you laugh about today, you may well end up crying about tomorrow. And what you cry about today, you may well end up laughing about tomorrow. Let life unfold, something we're also not comfortable doing. Let God's hand shape the course of events. Stick with the belief that there is a personal God. There's a God who gets his hands dirty, so to speak, with you and with me, and is involved in our everyday affairs. And it's not so, let's not be quick to run to judgment, whether we're looking at the mole on our friend's face or we're looking at the decisions that God makes as events unfold around us. Let's celebrate every opportunity we can to laugh together. Let's watch over and over again 300 missiles blowing up all over the place in the sky, and some of them on the ground where they harm no one, and some of them floating in the sea, and being literally ridden on by surfers a couple of days later. Yeah, we could laugh at those moments, but we could also endure the moments, the scary moments inside the safe rooms, with the sense that, I don't know, but it's good. Good is going to come of this. Because after all, the only way the Jewish people are here today, the only way we have a Seder today, 3,336 years later, when there's no such thing as an Egyptian as there was in the time of then. There's no such thing as a Roman, there's no such thing as a Greek, there's no such thing as a Persian, there's no such thing as any of these people. All the conquerors who stood proudly with their swords in their hands over the gates of Jerusalem and who built Arc de Triomphe, celebrating the conquest of the Jewish people, they are no more. We're here because we can look at every facet of our story and we can embrace it as with the sense of trust based on our experience. Yes, God put us through 210 years of enslavement, backbreaking, humiliating. We were naked. We were worn out. We didn't look good to the eye. We didn't smell good to the nose. But we had within ourselves an identity that is unbreakable. And we can only really pass that forward. We can only really explain it to our children well when we look at the whole story without any editing, when we look at the entire Haggadah, and we not only laugh over the 10 plagues, which is a perspective we shouldn't really have. And, by custom, we drop a little wine out of our cup out of the suffering of the Egyptians, believe it or not. That's a custom we have as Jewish people. But we also acknowledge the fact that we endured great humiliation, great suffering, great privation, and we did it with a certainty that just as had been foretold to Abraham originally, Yodoa Teda, know that your children will be enslaved in a land that's not theirs. They will be oppressed for a long period of time. And that was God's way of answering Abraham's question, how do I know my children will endure? People don't endure. If they're not successful, they fall by the wayside. If they are successful, they become full of themselves and they self-destruct. Abraham was a genius in asking that question of God. How could people survive throughout history? How could you tell me that will be the legacy of myself and Sarah, that will have such descendants? How could that be? And God's answer was, because they will suffer and they will prevail through that suffering. And then they will go on and do great things. And that pattern will repeat itself in such a way, such a fashioned, carefully curated manner, that it will create a people that is truly eternal. And I just want to conclude with the idea like this. People generally choose to live in a world where they admire brute power, cunning, outsmarting the other person, putting down the other person, using the vulnerabilities of others to their own advantage, taking advantage of openings in the marketplace in a way that, yeah, it's smart and it's intelligent, but it's a zero-sum approach to life. And I'm going to get what other people have. That's the world of tyrants. That's the world lives in. That's the news of the world. That's the Napoleons and the Putins and the Ayatollahs and all the other characters of history that have and are strutting and threading and standing upon the stage of history with the spotlight on them. We sit at our Seder intent and building a world of the spirit, a world based on trust in living in harmony with the founding principles that God created the world with. If you look in the book of Eov and the book of Job, it's not a book I understand very much of. If you go to chapter 38, sentence 4, Job's questioned everything. His friends have questioned everything. It's like they're on the verge of believing, as so many people do today. We live in a world bereft of meaning. Just grab what you can from it. Life is tough. Good people suffer. Bad people live it up. Take what you can. And then God opens God's mouth, so to speak. And God says one simple thing. Were you there when I placed the foundation of the world? You got to read chapter 38, sentence 4. And then God says, Hagad, speak, if you think you have the understanding of what this creation is all about. And what jumped out to me in preparing this class is the word Hagad. God says, Haggadah, tell your story. Tell me your story. Let's hear your story. Yeah, you have a story. And in your story, God is saying, for sure, I, God, am not the hero. There's been hard knocks. There's been difficulties. There's been things you can't explain. There's been things you can't understand. But I'm the one who put the foundation down for the world. I'm the one who endures. I'm the one who sees, as we say, 1,000 years in the scope of a day, who see things unfold. I'm God who built into the tapestry of the world the idea that the very people who suffer humiliation for 210 oppressive years in a land that's not theirs, by the most powerful nation on earth, intent on eliminating them from human history. And I built into the quality of the world that it's the very endurance and prevailing and b'damai chayi, by cherishing that blood that flows within your veins, that is the blood of Jewish identity, and yes, which the world spills very easily, and the world is very slow to condemn those who spill Jewish blood. But b'damai chayi, as counterintuitive as it seems, we weren't there when God laid the foundations of the world. We don't see enough of a perspective, but we're here. 3,336 consecutive Seders celebrated. We eat the bitter herb at each and every one of them, no matter what moment in history it is. This is our Haggadah. God challenges Job. You think you have the answers? Haggadah. Speak if you can understand. We're going to sit down at our Seders in the year 5784, where we have a lot that has jarred us and shaken us, where we're in a different place than we were when we celebrated the Seder last year. And as we say at the Seder night, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year may we be in a better place. But in the meantime, we're not editing the story. We're going to do the Haggadah. We're going to tell the whole story, the truth and the whole truth. And we're going to learn that, yes, there are blemishes. Yes, there are moments to be ashamed of. Yes, there are moments that we would like to cover up, but they're all integral to the story. And when we look at the whole story, and when we place it in consonance with the foundations of the world that God has laid, it's a great, great story to be part of. It's a great story to celebrate, no matter whether we're celebrating it in Bnei Brak, like the rabbis were there right after the temple was destroyed, or whether we're celebrating it at a time like King Solomon, when we have a newly built temple to celebrate. It's still a great story. You and I are part of it. We're proud to be part of it, and we certainly want to do everything we can to see to it that our children and our grandchildren feel as we do and carry the story forward. May we have a meaningful, wonderful Pesach Seder, and we fulfill the obligation of V'higadet levincha. Let's tell the story. Let's fulfill Magid, the whole story in its completion. And let's be wonderfully ready to celebrate all the great outcomes that we have. Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi.